Let's dive a little bit deeper into Darwin's theory of natural selection, which we're going to talk about here as descent with modification. All right, so again, we're going to explain the process of natural selection and describe how natural selection explains both the unity of life, how all life is related, and the diversity of life. Why are there so many different species? So let's talk about this tree really quickly that is a really famous sketching that Darwin put in some of his notes. So what he's representing here kind of crystallizes this idea that all species are related. And this is what we see here with this labeled A, B, C, D. Those are species that exist in current time, extant species, right? These nodes, he thought, represented their most recent ancestor, their shared ancestry. And then those lineages that are not labeled, he thought were species that had gone extinct, that existed at one point in time, you might have fossil evidence of, but are no longer around today. Okay, so he already was thinking that there's some sort of branching process. They share common ancestry and then they branch off and they change throughout time, but not all species survive to the present day. So he used this term, descent with modification, to describe the unity and diversity of life. What he means, what really we're trying to get at with that phrase is descent, meaning that they're inheriting characteristics and they share common ancestry, organisms do. But over time, organisms are going to accumulate differences. Populations or species will accumulate differences based on differences in their environment and what's required to survive in a given environment. Let's take this tree of modern elephants, for example, that we see right here. The most related organisms to modern elephants right here, the hyraxes and the manatees and sirens. They share a common ancestor with elephants all the way back here. And then the extant elephants of today are right here. So there's a lot of tips of the branches that don't extend all the way to modern times. So these are all fossil species, fossil relatives, ancient fossil relatives of modern elephants. And we can see that they share a lot of characteristics to modern elephants, but they're slightly different, right? So they're related, but over time, from 65 million years ago plus to today, they have accumulated or acquired slight differences, which has resulted in the form of elephants that we know of as today. In The Origin of Species, Darwin used an example of artificial selection to kind of drive home this idea that species can change over time. And the reason why he included this is because this is something that most people at the time were familiar with. Darwin actually spent a bunch of time breeding pigeons after he went on his voyage on the HMS Beagle in order to play with this idea that you can change organisms throughout generations. But there are already a lot of pre-existing examples of organisms changing based on humans selecting for traits that they desired. So for example, all of these different vegetables from kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, kohlrabi, all stem from one common wild ancestor. But throughout time, humans have selected varieties of this wild mustard based on characteristics that they like or that they desire, right? So one variety of wild mustard was bred to have big leafy leaves that were not super bitter, and we get kale. Another variety of wild mustard from the same species was selected to have really large and many axillary buds that we eat as Brussels sprouts. Or many flowers and condensed stems, we get broccoli, right? Enlarged stem, we get kohlrabi, right? So humans took this one species of wild mustard and over generations selected the plants that had characteristics that they desired and bred those together. And that's how we get modern crops. And that's how we get most of our modern crops. They've all been domesticated with the exception of berries through this same process of artificial selection. So artificial selection is humans determining which members of a population survive and reproduce and which don't, based on characteristics that humans want, right? Think dogs, domestic dogs. So this was evidence that species can change. So this is pretty powerful to include in On the Origin of Species. It wasn't that far of a stretch to think about, well, can't this happen in the natural world too? Right? If this can happen, humans can do this, why can't it happen in the natural world? There are a few key observations that Darwin made on his travels that Alfred Russel Wallace also kind of made, but we won't talk about here, that's going to be in another video. So the first observation that Darwin made that led to this idea of natural selection was there's individuals with varying inherited traits, right? Not all individuals in a population are identical. They all have slightly different traits, and those slight differences are passed on to the next generation. They're inherited by the next generation. Okay, so like all of these ladybugs, some are light yellow, some are dark red, they have different number of spots, different sizes of spots, right? And those are traits that are inherited. So organisms like this ladybug would probably tend to have mostly dark red offspring with medium-sized spots. Okay, so those differences are inherited. Darwin was also influenced and observed this idea that there's an overproduction of offspring. More offspring are produced in a generation than make it into adulthood, or then make it into adulthood and then also survive and reproduce. Darwin was influenced here by a guy named Thomas Malthus as well, who was one of the first people to really look at this idea that their human population is exploding, human population is growing exponentially, but the resources that are available are not growing exponentially, right? So Darwin was aware of Malthus. Malthus kind of caused a little bit of a kerfuffle, but the same idea Darwin could see playing out in the natural world. There are more organisms that are born, like all of these hundreds of frog eggs, than the environment can support. So those two observations led him to a couple inferences or conclusions that he could draw based on those observations. Those individuals that have traits, inherited traits that were passed on from their ancestors, that allow these individuals to be better at surviving and reproducing, will leave more offspring behind. The better you are at surviving, meaning not getting killed, getting resources, the better you are at passing on copies of those traits that allow also then your offspring to survive. So there's unequal rates of reproduction based on the inherited traits an organism has. And then if we let this idea play out over time, this unequal reproduction will lead to an accumulation of favorable traits in that population over time. So if we let this idea that those individuals that have traits that are helpful for existing and surviving in that certain environment, they're going to pass on those traits to the next generation, and then that next generation will also have an increased rate of reproduction if they have those favorable traits, right? So it's like here, blue is favorable, green is not favorable. Blue is just going to end up dominating the population. That blue trait is going to end up dominating the population. So we see that accumulation of differences in a population over time, leading to the species to change, leading to the population to change over time. And then eventually, over thousands or millions of years, that species will change over time. And so Darwin thought that this process could lead to adaptations. So an adaptation is any sort of characteristic or trait that lets an organism survive better or reproduce better in its environment. Okay, so there's some really extreme adaptations, like these praying mantises here, right? They are highly adapted to look or to mimic the flowers or the plants in which they live on, right? So an adaptation is any sort of trait that lets an organism survive better. This can be extreme like these guys, or it can be something as simple as being able to close your stomata if you're a plant when it gets hot, so that way you don't dehydrate, right? So it can be both physical characteristics as well as physiological characteristics can be adaptations. This process of natural selection results in adaptations or populations becoming better suited to surviving in their environment. And again, when we say environment, that natural part of natural selection, the environmental part, that can be both living and non-living aspects of the environment. That can be soil quality, that can be temperature, that can be presence of predators, competitors, right? Whatever it is, anything in the environment, living and non-living, can cause what we call a selective pressure to determine which organisms are fit and which organisms are not fit for that environment. Okay, so let's ask some questions to kind of clarify some common misconceptions with natural selection. So oftentimes the term evolution is used in a colloquial way to talk about change, right? Like you've evolved as a person, right? But when we're talking about biological evolution, individuals cannot evolve. We talk about evolution as the change in inherited characteristics or the change in genes, the frequency of genes in a population over time. Evolution happens at the population level. We measure evolution occurring at population level by measuring which traits, which genes become more common or less common throughout time over generations. So an individual cannot change their genetic composition, right? I can't change my genes. We can't change what genes we have. Unless you want to argue CRISPR with me, but that's a whole other discussion, right? So while natural selection acts on an individual, determining one individual can survive and reproduce because it's fit for the environment, this individual does not survive or does not reproduce because it is not fit for the environment. Okay, natural selection acts on the individual level, but we measure evolution on the population level by tracking changes in the frequency of traits over time. Okay, will an adaptation always and forever be adaptive? No. Because the environment changes, right? If the environment changes, that trait or characteristic that was adaptive in one environment might not be helpful in this new or different environment. Natural selection can only act on traits that are already present in a population, right? So it can't invent new characteristics. New characteristics, new traits arise through the random process of mutation, right? DNA, slight errors in DNA can sometimes result in new traits, okay? So that process is random. The generation of variation is random. The generation of new traits, mutation is one of the main drivers of that, is totally random. Natural selection does not cause that mutation to occur. All natural selection does is determine which mutations, which traits or new characteristics are favorable or not favorable in an environment. So I'm going to leave you with a thought experiment. Can natural selection fashion a perfect organism? Can natural selection result in an organism that does not need to change ever again at all? It's perfect for every single environment throughout time.